The woman noticed something strange as soon as she boarded the plane. Long-haul flights are usually fully booked. It was just her and her daughter boarding. Her daughter became silent since boarding, and an inexplicable sense of unease washed over her. Fortunately, after a while, passengers started boarding the plane one by one, which eased Kyle Pratt's concerns slightly. It was a 10-hour-long flight, and soon after takeoff, everyone fell into a deep sleep. Kyle Pratt noticed 2 rows of empty seats in the rear cabin and decided to lie down there with her daughter. It was from this moment that strange things began to happen. When she woke up from her nap, she discovered that her daughter was missing. At that moment, Kyle Pratt didn't realize the gravity of the situation and thought her daughter was simply playing somewhere on the plane. As she searched through all 3 levels of the aircraft and couldn't find her daughter, Kyle Pratt started to panic. After learning about her situation, a flight attendant made an announcement requesting all passengers to keep an eye out for a blonde girl of about 6 years old. Strangely, a considerable amount of time passed without any news, and even the passenger in front of Kyle Pratt claimed not to have noticed the girl with her. Kyle Pratt felt a sense of confusion and hurriedly returned to her seat to check. The teddy bear that her daughter always carried with her was clearly there, confirming that Kyle Pratt her memory was intact. She quickly requested the crew to conduct a thorough search of the entire plane. However, the staff didn't take it seriously, as no one could leave the sealed cabin at an altitude of 3,000 meters. They casually mentioned that they would report the matter to the captain when they found time, but even after 10 minutes had passed, the staff had not initiated any search. Suddenly, Kyle Pratt noticed 2 flight attendants whispering anxiously. She hurriedly approached them and inquired if something had happened to her daughter. The flight attendant who hung up the phone said that the flight attendant contacted the ground, and they did not find her daughter's registration record. Kyle Pratt thinks it's ridiculous that her daughter's name isn't on the passenger manifest. She hurriedly took out boarding pass to prove it, but the boarding certificate in pocket was only my own. Kyle Pratt's scalp felt numb in an instant. She ran to open the luggage compartment and found that her daughter's backpack was also missing. But this height daughter can't get it at all, so she must have been taken away by someone. Kyle Pratt panicked right away. She needs to talk to the captain quickly. Afterwards, she rushed to the cockpit desperately, but when she slammed on the hatch frantically, she was suddenly held down by the air police behind her. Her behavior has seriously affected other passengers, but the commotion caught the attention of the captain, who inquired if Kyle Pratt had consumed alcohol or taken any medication before boarding. It was apparent that he believed it was all a figment of Kyle Pratt's imagination. Kyle Pratt, feeling uncertain, replied hesitantly, admitting to taking some anti-anxiety medication. She then explained that her husband had tragically fallen to his death 6 days prior, and it was after that incident that she started taking the medication. This flight was intended to transport her husband's body back to their hometown for burial, and his casket was in the cargo hold of the plane. Growing increasingly agitated, Kyle Pratt asserted her certainty that her daughter had boarded the plane with her. She even recalled holding her daughter's hand before falling asleep, emphasizing that it was not a hallucination. Her distressed state evoked some sympathy from the captain. Despite everyone claiming not to have seen the girl, he decided to notify all passengers to return to their seats and check every possible place where a child could hide. However, this thorough search covered every corner of the cabin, including the overhead compartments, the cargo hold, and the restrooms, yet yielded no sign of the missing girl. They even searched the cargo hold and equipment compartments but found no trace of Kyle Pratt's daughter. Kyle Pratt continued to check under each row of seats, with Air Marshal Carson closely trailing behind her, fearing she might engage in any extreme behavior. As they passed by a row of passengers, Kyle Pratt suddenly noticed a bearded man who seemed familiar, but she couldn't recall where she had seen him before. Seeing that her daughter was still missing, Kyle Pratt's emotions surged once again. She insisted on personally inspecting the cargo hold and equipment compartments, as it seemed the crew members had not taken the matter seriously. Surprisingly, Kyle Pratt had been involved in the design of this aircraft and was familiar with every part of it. The captain, now losing patience, tried to contain his rage that passengers were not allowed to enter those areas. Carson offered to accompany Kyle Pratt for the inspection, identifying himself as an air marshal, but he was still rejected by the captain. The captain explained that if any accidents were to occur in the cargo hold with a passenger present, the airline would be held responsible. Furthermore, the chaos caused by Kyle Pratt's insistence that her daughter was missing had disrupted the cabin. At that moment, a flight attendant called the captain away, and Kyle Pratt suddenly remembered something and ran towards the passenger cabin.
I know I've seen you before!
She confronted the bearded man, questioning him about where he had hidden her daughter. It turned out that she recalled seeing him peeking into her daughter's room the previous night. However, The bearded man denied ever seeing her and promptly provided the name of the hotel where he stayed the previous night. He asserted that he had not left the hotel premises and suggested they could check his records. Carson immediately demanded to see his hotel bill, and the bearded man didn't hesitate, promptly producing the bill to confront her. With the proof, Carson had no choice but to take Kyle Pratt away, but Kyle Pratt saw that the only clue was about to be cut off, so he jumped on it desperately. Carson hurriedly dragged her up and took her out of the cabin. He warns Kyle Pratt that he will handcuff her if she messes around, then confronts Kyle Pratt. If those two people really stayed in the same hotel as him last night, why didn't they just kidnap her daughter last night? Instead, we have to attack this plane that has nowhere to escape. Obviously, Kyle Pratt's accusation is unreasonable. A series of questions made Kyle Pratt do not know how to answer, and at this moment, the broadcast announced that all passengers can start free activities, which means that the crew decided to stop the search. Kyle Pratt immediately went to the captain angrily berating him that he shouldn't have ended it hastily, but the captain told her an unacceptable news.
Where is she? Where is she?
Dead, goddammit!
They got a fax from the hospital where Kyle Pratt's husband died. He explained that her daughter and her husband were both taken to the hospital at the same time, and her husband jumped off the building with their daughter. This completely devastated Kyle Pratt, as she vividly remembered her daughter playing an incident occurred when her husband was born. Suddenly, she felt dizzy and wondered if she was going insane. The captain didn't say anything else and instructed Carson to take Kyle Pratt back to her seat. Kyle Pratt felt nauseous, and her mind went blank as she stumbled backward. The bearded man, determined to clear his suspicion, angrily pushed her down. Later, Kyle Pratt woke up in her seat, and the captain arranged for a psychologist to provide counseling for her. It is common for people to detach from reality after experiencing significant psychological trauma. Kyle Pratt gradually calmed down and tried to accept the reality. However, when she turned her head, she noticed small hearts drawn on the glass. Instantly, she became alert. The marks were clearly made by her daughter when they boarded the plane. Suppressing her emotions, she quickly requested to go to the restroom to have a moment of tranquility. Carson didn't refuse her request to accompany her. Before entering, Kyle Pratt asked him to unlock the handcuffs. Once inside, Kyle Pratt took off her shirt, wrapped it around her fist, and smashed open the door above, revealing the equipment compartment of the plane. At that moment, Carson, worried about any mishaps, knocked on the door. Kyle Pratt quickly lowered her head and said she would be out soon. Immediately, she selected a wire and inserted it, causing all the overhead oxygen masks to drop. Everyone thought it was an emergency situation, and chaos ensued in the cabin. Taking advantage of the confusion, Kyle Pratt broke another wire, causing a short circuit and plunging the cabin into darkness. Kyle Pratt emerged from the restroom amidst the chaos and rushed into the cargo hold through the elevator. She shouted her daughter's name loudly, but there was no response. At that moment, the captain informed Carson that the plane had not triggered any abnormal alarms. Carson immediately realized that Kyle Pratt was behind all this mischief. After a thorough search, Kyle Pratt discovered her husband's coffin. She suddenly realized that her daughter might be hidden inside, so she quickly opened the coffin. However, she found only her husband's lifeless body inside. Kyle Pratt instantly collapsed, hoping that someone would come to her aid. At that moment, Carson found her again and wasted no time handcuffing her, stating that due to her antics, the captain had decided to initiate an immediate landing at the nearest airport. Meanwhile, Kyle Pratt became even more convinced of her suspicions. If her daughter had indeed died along with her husband, there should have been two coffins brought onto the plane. She then requested to continue the search once the plane landed. However, Carson informed her that she would be immediately arrested once the plane touched down. As she walked back to her seat through the aisle, people began applauding. The behavior of this crazy woman caused delays for everyone, and Carson took her to the back row. Despite being seated, Kyle Pratt remained steadfast in her beliefs and made a request to Carson.
If you let them arrest me, she's gone forever.
I'm begging you.
Seeing her pitiful state, Carson seemed to soften a bit. After a moment of silence, he called a flight attendant and asked her to keep an eye on Kyle Pratt while he went to talk to the captain. It seemed like he was going to help Kyle Pratt. However, as soon as he turned around, he sneaked into the cargo hold and directly found Kyle Pratt's husband's coffin. Tearing open the outer layer of sponge, he discovered two bombs and a detonator hidden inside. It turned out that all of this was his plot. Kyle Pratt's daughter was indeed on the plane. He had hidden her in the equipment compartment and installed the bombs on both sides of the girl's head. Then, he found the captain and handed him an account number, stating that Kyle Pratt demanded an immediate payment of $50 million, or else they would detonate the plane. Then he said that Kyle Pratt had carried the explosives through her husband's coffin. Upon hearing this, the captain became panicked but still wanted to talk to Kyle Pratt. Carson quickly intervened, falsely claiming that Kyle Pratt didn't want to negotiate with anyone. According to him, Kyle Pratt clearly didn't want to harm anyone, otherwise, she wouldn't have let the passengers disembark first. He suggested that the captain request the airline to immediately transfer the money, making Kyle Pratt believe she was in control of the situation. Once all the passengers had exited the plane, they could arrest her. With no other ideas, the captain reluctantly nodded in agreement and returned to the cabin. Suddenly, a flight attendant stopped him. It turned out she was his accomplice. She had pretended to receive a call from the ground, stating that there was no record of Kyle Pratt's daughter boarding the plane. She was also the one who provided the captain with the fake facts confirming the death of Kyle Pratt's daughter. However, she seemed nervous at the moment, while Carson had already devised a detailed plan.
She's gonna be dead 10 minutes after we land.
And the only witness, Kyle Pratt's daughter, would be blown to pieces. Shortly after, he received a message from the captain, confirming that the large sum of money had been transferred to the designated account. Carson couldn't help but smirk. His plan had already succeeded by more than half. Now all he had to do was wait for the right moment to deal with Kyle Pratt, and everything would be seamless. He lied to Kyle Pratt, telling her that after the plane landed, both of them would need to stay behind. Once all the passengers had disembarked, 2 police officers would come to assist them in continuing the search. Kyle Pratt believed what he said. After the plane landed, everyone began to exit, including the crew members. However, when Kyle Pratt saw the captain, she suddenly rushed towards him, saying that she would find her daughter in a few minutes. She demanded an apology from the captain when she found her daughter, and the captain had finally had enough of the ordeal.
Miss Pratt, your money has been wired, just as you asked. Perhaps we can do without the pretense of the missing child now.
Hearing these words, Kyle Pratt became confused. Carson, realizing that his plan was about to be exposed, quickly pretended everything was normal and prepared to get off the plane. But the clever Kyle Pratt looked at the heightened security measures and the way people were looking at her. She immediately understood that it was all Carson's conspiracy. She called out loudly to Carson, and he brazenly confronted Kyle Pratt, provoking her. At that moment, everyone believed that Kyle Pratt was the real hijacker, but if he dares to reveal the truth, then the first one to die would be her daughter. Afterwards, they made all the crew members disembark from the plane. Carson closed the cabin door, and in that split second when he turned his head, Kyle Pratt threw a fire hydrant at him. Taking advantage of his dazed state, she quickly pulled out handcuffs and pinned Carson against the railing. Then, she found the detonator in another pocket. Just then, the flight attendant emerged. She had been hiding and hadn't disembarked. Seeing her approach, Kyle Pratt instantly knew her daughter was hidden in the equipment compartment. Carson pulled out a gun from his sock. Upon seeing this, Kyle Pratt quickly escaped, and Carson shot and shattered the handcuffs as he chased after her. Fortunately, Kyle Pratt managed to evade the bullets and took refuge in the cockpit. Outside the door, Carson became infuriated and provocatively revealed the entire truth. It turned out that her husband didn't jump off the building by himself. In Carson's plan, it was necessary to frame a hijacker who was familiar with the aircraft's structure. Kyle Pratt was the perfect candidate, and she pushed Kyle Pratt's husband off the building. Because the casket would not be subjected to X-ray inspection at the airport, he could hide the bomb inside and bring it on board the plane. Then, while Kyle Pratt was asleep, he quietly kidnapped her daughter, and with the cooperation of the flight attendant, they staged the whole act. Meanwhile, Kyle Pratt had climbed up to the overhead compartment. She deliberately threw a book to create a disturbance, making it seem like she was escaping. When Carson took the bait and chased after her, she cautiously opened the cockpit door, but just as she took a few steps out, the flight attendant stopped her. Kyle Pratt realized that she was extremely flustered at the moment, and with just a few probing questions, she blanked out. Seizing the opportunity, Kyle Pratt threw a punch, and Carson, who heard the commotion, chased after her. Despite everything, Kyle Pratt ran to the equipment compartment. Finally, she found her still unconscious daughter, but no matter what, her daughter couldn't be awakened. As Carson's footsteps approached from above, Kyle Pratt looked at the 2 bombs and came up with an idea. She quickly hugged her daughter and hid beneath Carson's feet. Carson taunted and challenged Kyle Pratt to come out and settle things with him. Meanwhile, Kyle Pratt calmly maneuvered behind him, and once she and her daughter were hidden in the passage separated by the door, Carson also noticed her.
What are you gonna do? You gonna blow us up?
No, just you.
After saying those words, he closed the cabin door and pressed the detonator. causing flames to burst out on the plane. Shortly after, Kyle Pratt carried her daughter and walked off the plane. As people passed through the thick smoke and saw Kyle Pratt's face and the child she was holding, they realized that Kyle Pratt had been right from the beginning. Once everything settled, the captain solemnly apologized to her. People looked at Kyle Pratt as if she were a hero, believing that from then on, no one would ever question a mother's determination to protect her child.